Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Urban Fae, The Selkie Feud, Part 2, by Michael Lockhart. Who knew he'd have air support? One of the gang leaders asked rhetorically. We still put a hurt on him, eh? Sony nodded sagely, his eyes hidden behind two dark lenses of his shade. It was the following evening, almost 24 hours after the raid. Yeah, we definitely tore up his operation for a while. Now he knows he can't push us. Skittle and I sat silently. We'd spoken with one another before the meeting and knew that while we had enjoyed a victory, it was a minor one. Judging from the number of troops who'd been running to defend the exit at the back of the pyramid, it was clear that Serpente had a surfeit of soldiers. The wall and the pyramid were mostly intact, except for the front face of the pyramid was in shambles, and the stepped seating on the east face above the entrance was scorched and pitted, yet the interior was sound. The buildings around the inside perimeter of the wall had been pocked with bullets and holed with small rockets and grenade blasts. Then ravaged by fire, they'd been filled with sex slaves, customers, gamblers, drugs, and a few employees to keep the masses in line. Now the rubble and ashes held only corpses. It was a shame about those who had been trafficked. They remained victims until the end. One more score to settle against Serpente. Fortunately, while the hit was heavy, it was always intended to be short. More than half the vehicles made it back out of the main gate when the Quetzal Dragon arrived. With the glamour in place, they saw it as a long, sleek helicopter that spit phosphorus rounds and shoot up the back end of the convoy. The graybeards had perished to a man, their choppers twisted and bent in the wreckage, but the writhing fire from their compact submachine guns had made their attacker decided to hunt elsewhere. Several had died because they were blinded and crashed, mostly into their fellows. It was a glorious end for the raggle-taggle remnants of a once tough outfit. Sony had turned his gaze towards me and now wore a questioning look. I realized that I had vegged out. Sorsha saved me. Yes, we were not able to breach their perimeter, but we did some damage to the army. They were about to sally and hit our people as they left the compound. Fortunately, Red Wolf tore at least some of them a new one, and reminded the others that it's not safe to go outside their own block. Sony smiled his oily smile. Yeah, we did real good. His eloquence amazed no one. He got plenty of soldiers, but they gonna be busy. We hit him with a big fist. Now we can snap fingers to take out the small groups. He snapped his fingers a few times to illustrate whatever he'd meant to say. Perhaps that we'd broken up the main force and they'd have to divide to pick up the pieces. We could then attack them piecemeal. Maybe. Shabil, Kitsune Riddy, Sorsha, and I met and determined that we would work out our own scheme to complete the fight that had now grown into a feud. Kitsune turned out to be not only the name of the small clan of Fae, but the name of their leader, a very foxy lady, or Reddy. Shabil had warned me that they had a reputation similar to the coyote of American folklore. Tricksters. However, Serpente had apparently stepped on this lady's multiple tails, so the efforts of her clan were set to the same purpose as ours. She slid her eyes over to meet mine. I liked you as Coyote, but you have grown, in many ways, to fit your new title. Besides, the Coyote would eventually have become unhappy, and he is strong in this land. I was sorry to hear about what Serpente did to your foster parents. I hear that the Hearn is soon to retire. At least the old one. That did it. I blinked first. I leaned forward, an eyebrow raised with an unasked question. She'd realized that I didn't know something that her spies, foxes indeed, had discovered. I would think your friend among the police would have told you, but she didn't realize it was relevant, or assumed that your grandfather may have known and told you. Serpente discovered your secrets from his contacts and connections in the city and county government, the ones he owns. He personally led the squad that hit the Hearn home. I think he wanted to be able to tell you that at some point, perhaps to send you into a frenzy of rage. Snafu bar! I shouted in my mind as my lips curled upward in a snarl, not at the messenger, but at the author of that misery. Poor Miss Molly. This was the final straw. I set my intent on the slaughtering that miserable. I caught my anger, and Sorsha played her part by taking my hand. I forced my snarl to turn into a smile for her. Then I turned back to Kitsune Ready. Gratitude for the information, my lady. It would indeed have been unfortunate to let Serpente control my reaction to the news. He may have other catalysts to goad me, but that one has lost its power, thanks to your warning. She gave a polite nod bow, and we moved on to other subjects. We needed assistance from the other world, since Serpente's reach had far exceeded anything the mundane gang turds would believe. He was truly an organized crime family, along the classic lines. All to himself. Well, enthralled to his family, like the other capos tended to be. He had supporters in Otherworld, and Fae in Mundania to help him accomplish his goals, which were still murky, though there would be a great benefit to controlling this city, built on a set of Fae mounds. So, perhaps that was all he really wanted at this point. Before we set off on our plea for assistance in Otherworld, Sorsha and I had to make a stop. It was primarily my stop. I called Bart and asked if I could visit Mr. Hearn at his place. He readily acquiesced, and we rode the horses in their cool glamours over to see the choosers of prey. I tried to disguise my shock when I saw the Hearn. He looked old and worn beyond his years. Apparently the damage he took, both physical and spiritual, had been worse than anyone had fathomed. He managed a warm smile of greeting, and when I told him my new title, with sincere modesty, he smiled in pride. The Red Wolf. Fitting. Ferocious attitude, but still no beard. I think it will one day grow in flaming red. I see that Sorsha has been the wonderful influence on you that Molly and I hoped she would be. He winked at my love, and she grinned conspiratorially in return. I let it pass. With others it would have annoyed me, but with these two, it was just the way we worked as a family. I was now comfortable with that concept, and no longer felt surprised or odd, as often as I once had, that we were anything more than a group of people who knew one another. So I have something to tell you. It's about the night Ms. Molly and you. It was harder to tell than I thought it would be. We all choked up to varying degrees at the mention of the sweet foster mother whom I'd grown to love before Serpente. That thought squashed my morning with anger. We know who orchestrated that abhorrent act. The Otherworld Lord who has taken over and built a criminal enterprise here in Mundania. He snatched up power all around the city and already turned much of it into a war zone. I didn't tell him about Centennial Park. He may have already known, but I didn't want to remind him. The proximity to that park had drawn he and Miss Molly to the old house when they were a young couple. He'd suffer to see its current fate. Still another score to settle. He assumed a grim look and seized my hand in a dry grip that spoke of strong hands, drained and feeble, yet tight with purpose. Red Wolf of the Gaelic Wolf Clan, I invoke your gaze. You shall hunt down the author of the murder and bring me his head. If I am already gone, you shall deliver it to my son Bart. You will do this on pain of death, and as wereguide for bringing such a dreadfulness to our doorstep." His voice had grown strong, like it had been in his healthier days, and his intensity gripped my mind even as his hand gripped mine. He just put a powerful obligation on me. He may have forgiven, but he clearly hadn't forgotten why he and his love had been targeted. All I could do was nod in acquiescence. After all, I now understood just how passionate a man could be regarding the love of his life. "Yes, sir, I will fulfill the quest as required. Not just because you set it on me, but because the creature exposed my own lady to harm and because I loved Ms. Molly. I regret that I never said those words to her, so I will show you in deeds. If there is an afterlife, you can tell her for me." He sat back, drained but satisfied, the weary smile once more warming his face and removed a few years, the grimness gone. "I know you'll succeed, Rob. I feared you might resist or grow angry that I brought your gaze to bear. My antlered friend, excuse me." He made an odd little gesture and continued. "The Horned Lord gave me the information. Certain high powers of the Fae possess an incredible amount of knowledge about their own kind, especially those who are or were considered deities. I believe he meant well. He rarely takes sides, but he took a liking to you. Your manners have improved, and maybe your attitude, so I hope you recognize the great honor he showed you by taking part in the events of your life beyond his normal scope. It could cause contention among his peers, which is no trivial matter." I bowed. I do see the honor, and as I said, I would pursue this for Sorsha and Miss Molly as far as I can, and beyond, no matter who or what stands in the way. We shook hands, and Sorsha and I left to set about the quest. We dropped off Sigrid at the horse farm. She had had her adventure and assumed that equines had a language that contained the meaning to convey it. She'd earned some bragging rights. She also picked up a foal that was growing inside her, courtesy of MB, which was part of her wishing to go on the raid while she was still able. When Fiona informed us, I looked up at my noble steed. "So, I'm going to be an uncle?" He grinned and nickered and nodded. If he'd been able, he may have blushed. Sorsha settled for congratulating the parents-to-be, and we doubled up on Herr Manfred Bravo and exited the patrol at the rear of the stable. Just below the big screen, an old western blasted forth above us, one of the ones which the haunting music by that Italian composer, Morricone. Sorsha told me the tune was called "The Ecstasy of Gold." I thought it sounded like cool quest music. We weren't searching for that kind of gold, but I'd be happy to cut some golden scales, or better yet, some pale ones. "Back so soon, Macta Dig?" Macta greeted us in her warm, purring voice. She still looked ancient to me, but I'd never tell her so. She looked better the more I considered her as an ally, or at least a potential one. I think she still had some reservations about my honorability, if not my capabilities. She seemed genuinely happy to greet Sorsha and patted her unruly hair. The wild, bright mass must have been tantalizing to a cat being. She led us into the master's antechamber, just outside Grandfather's office, or private audience chamber. It looked more like a chamber than an office. with all the preserved heads that lined the rows of shelves near the high ceiling. Not all of them were strictly anthropomorphic, mind you. He greeted us after only a few moments. "Good day, Lady Sorsha, lovely lass." He hugged her and glanced at me over her shoulder. "You too, grandson." Much less enthusiastically, but he winked. He was having his own kind of fun. For him, such an attempt at humor was downright effulsive. He must have had some good news recently. Perhaps he'd lopped off the head of someone who desperately deserved it. He did not make us stand uncomfortably or anything, and presently waved to a couple of comfortable-looking chairs and indicated the pitcher and goblet set on the tray between them. "Help yourself if you'd like a drink. I was going over a message from Shabil." He tapped a piece of what looked like parchment on his side table. There was no aircraft carrier-sized desk with a computer kiosk to one side to demonstrate his importance. This wasn't Mundania. "You two did very well under the circumstances. We suspect Serpente might have a Quetzal dragon. Now we know for sure. We also know that Mundanian weapons can hurt it on that side. That information was more valuable than anything else you accomplished, other than survival." He gave his wolfish grin of approval. All of his grins were wolfish, but I'd learned to interpret the subtleties. Perhaps there was even an odor that went with the approval versus rebuke. I was growing wolfish in my own right. It would have been nice to have been forewarned about the airborne nightmare. Weird-looking things with a weird beam weapon, like some DARPA would invent for a space force. I winked at Sorsha. He shrugged. "If I'd warned you, you would have approached differently, shown caution, or felt fear. Everyone talks about the dangers of dragons. Some other types are bigger and more ferocious. This type is very dangerous, with the sunray eyes. But a fire drake would have finished you before you got started. Besides, this was just a child, and you tend to handle surprises well. And Lady Sorsha was with you. So stop playing at whinging." This time he winked at Sorsha. "Now we have to work on gathering a force. Serpente has been working at it for longer and has the backing of powerful beings on this side and what passes for powerful in mundane world." I nodded. "Maybe we could get one of those other types of dragons to help with our air power?" He gave me an almost disgusted look. "Most dragons rarely ally with anyone. They have their own purposes. Only some of the younger members of the smaller breeds, like the ones you encountered, are typically seduced into serving with, almost never for, other beings or powers. That one was young, considering its small size and weak rays. If you want air forces, you'll have to find them elsewhere." I nodded and looked over to Sorsha. At the same time, we grinned and said, "Super drones." Then we did that pinky thing to avoid a curse. She added, "I'm sorry, but I just don't know the folks of my family clans. We simply haven't had time." The Mactir Moor gave her an indulgent smile. "Well enough, my dear. The Red Seal clan is something special. They rarely commit as a clan for the cause of others, and they are almost all Selkie. You may be better off with the Goose Clan side of your lineage when recruiting mundane folk. Might not think much of geese. But the birds are actually quite large and fierce, and that clan fights very well as a team. They are almost all aligned with the light. They have water and air assets. The Shiogween, the wee beings who helped us in the dungeons below the Great Tower, they won't likely get involved. It's rare that anyone rates their assistance. My point is, there are many folk who fly. You had a chief member of the Hawk Clan help with scouting, didn't you? I agreed that we had plenty of aerial resources. What about ground forces? I inquired. Sony's crew and the Kitsune was all I was able to muster on that side, unless you count Lieutenant Falk, which you apparently do. He stared at me as though I had suffered some sort of brain injury that caused me to be obdurately simple. Naturally, you may count on her and the minions she has recruited. You also helped Shabil recruit several of the crew, as you call them. They came not only for him, but because they knew you from your courtier days. You did a good job and were discreet. Performance garners respect even among criminals. Plus, you now have a reputation as some type of assassin, spread by the most powerful communication tool among their strata of society. Idle gossip. I believe such is now enhanced with personal data devices by which they exchange information. I'd hoped we'd have more time. Perhaps you could have served in one of the Mundanian armed forces and recruited from them. Now we'll have to use what we have. I thought he flashed a quick eye at Sorsha, but I couldn't swear to it. The man possessed many nuanced thoughts. You, however, will have to help prepare the Otherworld contingent. Most of the common troops have never traveled to Mundania, and will need some perspective on what to project and how to conduct themselves, especially the wolves of our clan. He smiled at my look of surprise. You will need to meet them anyway. They are of a certain type, as are the various species of wolves associated with other wolf clans in Otherworld. He shook his head in mock sorrowfulness. Still so much to learn, even with your title. Perhaps you are too young to bear such a burden. When I entered the dens, an area just outside the fort proper, I almost drew my weapons. The wolves that emerged from their dirt and stone dwellings looked no different than those we'd encountered in Fulshire Tower on the 33rd floor. Yet there was a feel, a smell. These were at least willing to give me a sniff before they attacked. The big bad wolf and Sorsha held back to let me approach on my own. The alpha approached and I stood stock still while he examined me, head to foot and back. His head rose from the ground to just below my shoulders when he stood on all fours. Good boy. Good boy. Good gulp. Giant wolf. Don't eat the nice young man. I couldn't help but think the mantra and hope that he'd agree. Eventually he appeared satisfied and snuffled out the excess odors, then gave me a wolf grin. Ultimately, we ended up with 4 volunteers from his pack. They would join us while we assembled the rest of the troops, so that we could learn from one another how to best communicate and join our efforts, so that they could form the core of my honor guard. Next came my chariot team. Garen had decided to serve me and his team. A pair, mare and stallion. Amelia and Hendrix were both young and eager. They were friends of MB and were eager to show him up with their own performance. I discovered that horses always love to compete with one another. Sorsha did her part and recruited a squadron from the Goose clan. A large number of them had known and respected her father. We even picked up a flock of geese to help with scouting and guard duties. Geese Home, as their fortress was called, was a tall, slender pinnacle that perched against a rock face that overlooked a pristine lake. The pinnacle rose along and then above the cliff. There were resting places all along the face of the wall, and tunnels bored into the rock face from the tower. The lake was busy with fish and other creatures, and the water seemed alive with teeming masses beneath and upon its waves. A river ran from the lake down to a gray sea where the graceful ships of their fleets docked. Lakes, rivers, and seashores were apparently popular landscaping motifs in Otherworld. A small city that had grown up around the docks. It was protected by walls, the river, and the sea. The folk were every bit as noble and honorable as had been Mr. Gosling. They regaled us with tales of his voyage over the course of many years. He had discovered new lands and peoples, and had made many friends and more enemies than he ever wanted. It seemed odd that a man so accomplished in at least 2 worlds could be as humble as he was, could take an interest in an orphan boy, even one related to his friend. I was once again touched and grateful for all he'd done as a mentor and as a net to catch my fall. I hated that we had so little time to spend in the place that had produced him, and in turn my Sorsha, and vowed that we'd return if we were able. Sorsha picked up a few from the Red Seal clan. All Selkies, they maintained a little aloofness from all but Sorsha. We assigned them to be her special team, as the wolves were mine. The Red Seal clan castle was seaside, not terribly far from the Goose clan harbor. The edifice looked as if it had grown from a slate-gray rock of the cliffs that overlooked the sea. It was squat and sturdy, rather than tall and graceful, yet it was nice-looking, and built to Fae standards. Surrounding it was gray sand, gray water, gray sky, every hue of gray the way the Quetzaldragon's plumage was every shade of red and yellow. A brilliant monochromatic landscape, like an old classic movie. The lack of primary colors did nothing to detract from the majesty of the place. Another vow to return, another hope cast to the fates, the Norns, the Weavers. I picked up a few of each from the 2 different Rowan clans, a pair from my mother's people, who were distant cousins, and a squad from the Far West clan that was associated with the area of Mundania that had been covered in concrete, steel, and mortals to form my urban jungle. They were an aggressive bunch. The mortal Anthros among my maternal grandmother's Western Raven clan were into chariots the way grandfather was, and spoke reverently of the Moragu. She was both their goddess and high queen. I was careful to remain respectful. Members of both clans were often grim, but could turn raucously humorous in a flash. Then back to brooding, on to anger, despair. Their moodiness helped explain my own emotional range. Grandma Raven had always been at High Court, so we didn't get to meet her. Her duties were with the Morrigan Court. I had to wonder what her people would report to her about the grandson she'd abandoned on Mundania. I knew it was a forlorn side quest, but I had to approach the Griffin clan. The Mactir Moor had cautioned me that they worked as individuals, and most of the lords and ladies of the clan were actually griffins rather than anthros. I was bound by courtesy to approach their chief, in their case, and actual king, and I secretly hoped that he would deny me an audience. Naturally, their clan lived far enough away that Sorsha and I had to negotiate several portals and cross or circle several realms to make the journey. There was no direct pathway. We had to do that for several others of our visits, but this one was a long journey for Otherworld, where there were so many shortcuts. Most realms simply placed guards at the entrances and near critical portals. Others had hostels and forts, like the crossroads at Dun Amaris. As usual, there was little consistency, and each realm and province followed the customs they saw fit to their needs. We used a hostel when we were about to cross into Griffin Realm. It had looked like the step-sided pyramid towers at Angkor Wat. The Guardian had been a beautiful, larger-than-average clouded leopard. She had been very polite and asked for news instead of demanding it. She hadn't cared much for my 4-pack of wolves. They'd remained at the entrance to her hall. But the hostility between the natural enemies burned through the gazes down the open spaces before her dais. However, she seemed to like the 3 Selkies who escorted Sorsha. While they appeared as standard anthros, at the moment, they smelled of the sea and still had fish breath. What cat wouldn't like that? The hostel was a different setup, more like a hotel than a communal space. Sorsha took a look around the space. According to our hostess, the next realm is ruled by a Kirin. There are a few anthros in it. Maybe we should just plan a vacation visit. She looked coyly over her shoulder. Or maybe a stop on our honeymoon. She caught me off guard once again and laughed at my standard foobar expression. It was definitely an intriguing place, and I was sad that I could not stay longer. Gracious, long-sought meetings and abrupt, unwanted departures seemed to be the theme of this quest to gather my army. The Griffin clan actually dwelt on a different planet. Otherworld was a transitional planet, or plane, connected with many other worlds. It was sometimes hard to tell where and when we were, and how things connected. As we traveled through the friendly enough kin realm, I caught Sorsha looking at me from the corner of her eye. "What?" I asked, knowing that it would be something weird. I was right. She shrugged. "I was just thinking in terms of Mundania, where we both grew up. We're aliens, the science fiction kind. It all gets a little complicated." I could only agree. True, but I think this is a subject where we can let go of what we heard growing up and focus on what is. That's the part I find difficult. What to keep and what to discard of Mundania. They're right in many ways, in other ways they have no clue. She nodded and frowned all at once. I think they once knew, but have forgotten. The truth has been muddled with so many agendas from people with short lives. That's what gets to me. The fact that our lives will be so long, provided we survive being murdered or falling in battle. She was weird but intelligent, and I loved her for both. So quote, this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.